like the title probably states, I don't know what it's going to be. This is about high efficiency and power air cars. All right. That's right. Now, this one's a different setup entirely. Mostly because, well, air is a poor energy storage at best and isn't used well at all. It really just kind of boggles the mind how people treat it in such a substantially bad way. But I can't blame them, mostly because of the way we try to capture energy has been done so pretty much the same way for so long that people have become unable to see outside of the box they're in. Which is a rage bait beginning, intentionally to get you to listen. So, we're gonna take a step back and get you understanding how the basics of energy storage as air works on average. You either have a canister that is pressurized or condensed, and so as it off gases and phase changes, you can get that stored energy placed into something that does a given type of work energy. That's neat, but it's garbage. Alright, and the reason why is because it never uses that lost energy and it's very inefficient, and truthfully, there's other energy around you in the form of our air, pressure, and our atmosphere, light, and more. So, we'll need to discuss how heat pumps work with a given compressor, a stored tank, lubrication, and one side that wants to absorb something and the other that wants to put it somewhere else. Work energy with the compressor is what helps make that occur. Well, if you want to store gas as a pressurized vessel, you would probably imagine I'm going to go with, we're going to take the off-gassing and we'll bleed that as an extra cold for some Stirling and piezoelectrics and Bob's your uncle. But you're a stupid dumbass and should probably shut up. Not a bad idea, for what it's worth, but it's cumbersome and really bad, truthfully, at being efficient. It has a lot of conversion losses to work energy, and it's just poor at managing itself as a design. Then we're going to talk about how if you want to try and get energy from the air, the atmosphere, there's not as much as you might expect, except people do it incorrectly because they think thermodynamics, it's only heat. They don't look at air properly in the slightest way in my mind, and usually I look at them funny and they think poorly of me as well. The reason why I'm saying these things is mostly because a bunch of people that are ADHD and are very, very likely to just try and rush forward and believe that they know what I'm going to say, or most likely hear, because I'm a genius and I can get it and blah, 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 will happen. And I know so much more and blah, 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 blah. And as proven by the vacuum brake system, you are most likely unaware of something that I know of. And you should probably listen. So, We'll talk about the beginnings, and then we'll get to the end, instead of skipping to the end and explaining it. If you know anything about why we know how energy is captured by our Earth from the star we orbit, you know that it is not just light that we receive. We also happen to have a change from light to a orbital mechanic property that is often not thought of as relevant. Charged particles moving around us with the magnetosphere that we are in, and the fact that the elicited change of our field dynamics together with the humidity in our atmosphere and the dust there too makes lightning static charge differences. And coronas in lower pressure environments, which are emitting very large amounts of light that, for all intents and purposes, is a bunch of energy that you didn't capture. All that is to say, you're probably unaware of how much actual energy potential is really in our atmosphere and always around us. We just don't use it well. When we talk about a given pressure vessel, which is irrelevant because we're not going to, but I'll give you one real quick little history lesson. When we learned how to store our gas around us, it wasn't because we had a tank. It was because somebody placed a tube up their anus and filled it, the colon of that individual. It's a old ass story that is hilarious because the person wanted to prank someone with a very, very long-winded flatus in their face. They had a spiteful nature to an individual that would not shut up about how much they knew so much more than this other individual and were better than them. And that's how we learned how to store gases. If you are unaware of that story, now you know. It's a big, wonderful, old as fuck, one of the oldest examples of written language we actually have of an account of someone doing this to an individual. Which probably says we knew before that, if they knew enough to put a tube into their rear end and blow into it to store more air. Just as an FYI. But man, I gotta hand it that guy. He really wanted to get back at that person. But it's funny because it's like, did you not catch it? The work energy of the battery, that is your body, has a storage compartment with a valve. It's going to get more because, if you're unaware, you eat food and you process it and you produce flatus, making more from the given heat and movement that you do on a daily basis. This is the premise, and that's why I talked about it. You're probably a bunch of idiots that don't even see how much your body does more, and it's wasted. So, instead of vacuum storage here, we're going to talk about how with basic electrical charge differences, like the field that I talked about for the Hall effect and the vacuum braking system I have, piezoelectrics, a definite battery that's surrounding the tank that is kind of the tank of the storage of air, of course, that's inside of it. And instead of being condensed liquid, it's just regular air. And the battery is to start the engine spinning and get it going to start making heat and pressure differentials to occur, along with a charge difference and the humidity difference, along with the light helping with magnets to create a change in a given ionic-esque style of gas, together with something even better. With the operation of the vehicle, we gain rolling resistance and thermal dynamic heat as air resistance occurs. The operation of the vehicle is such that it bleeds energy, but it also makes more energy as it goes through its process of being used. We are also constantly around more energy than you might expect at first. So, if you take a small chance at being quiet and listening, you'll get the whole way of making this. So, nice little dramatic pause for you're probably angry or want to skip ahead, and I'll just keep continuing doing that for a while and talking nonsense and pretending things and blah 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 and so on and so forth until you skip ahead even further, and I'll continue doing that. So that way you'll shut the fuck up and just listen, instead of trying to skip ahead. Is this painful for you? I hope it is. Did you get to this part? I want to know. Tell me now. I imagine you saying, right? All right. The basic is we're no longer going to be using a standard engine to be doing work energy in any aspect or way. The first prototype idea concept I had started with a basic opposed piston engine, using air to spin ultimately a turbine in a way that drew in and compressed more air, but then it exchanged into the air that was already coming in. And of course, we do have a battery to try and start the darn engine for a reason. Most engines have batteries and starter motors. Just as an FY fucking I. So, if you thought that's cheating, then you're probably stupid. But it was an opposed piston, right? Except I have my single stroke injector technology. It has a spinning part inside of a chamber with a chamber outside of it. As it spins down, it'll also spin back up. As a result, it compresses air and also draws air in and then fires it into a nozzle. But then it's loading it in up at the top, and it does it again, 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 and it does it again. Standard single-stroke types of injector technology, except it constantly spins, and it constantly allows for a continuation of drawing more air in and further compression. So we went from a compression of compressed air to an even further compression with even more air, to an even further compression into the injector, until it went into another compression called the nozzle point. And then it expanded. Into a vessel that was sealed and did work, right? As it moved it, of course you're trying to capture that as some amount of work energy, right? That's the prototype, so hold your horses. Now, all of that has to move somehow, and most air engines are kind of bad, if I'm going to be honest. So, that's one of the reasons why I don't like them. But, now, we're going to take a little step back. We're going to describe that there needs to be valves here. We have ring valves that are going to be sliding. I always talk about how you can have bearing journals on a crankshaft, and they're circles. They're just fine with sliding around for very long periods of time under large amounts of heat and pressure, so long as you've got lubrication. Well, they're basically a version of that, with a little bit of a bump stop to help with the mechanical timing of the single-stroke injection system. Although, for what it's worth, it's really just telling it to advance or retard timing as to where ultimately in its RPM range it needs to get best efficiency. Right? Now, one part of it happens to be carved out. As in, there's nothing there, so now it's a valve. That's how a valve works. If you weren't aware, there's nothing in one spot, and then when it's there suddenly, then air goes through that spot. How did you do that? How does this work? Are you kidding? I can't imagine how that would work. If there's nothing there, then how does the thing stay together? So, Swiss cheese is together, right? Well, yes, no, I suppose. So there are other spots that are connected between the holes. Yes, no, I guess that is true. I'm stupid. No, we know. We know you are. Just leave it alone. Sometimes people don't understand things quickly. Let's put it that way. So, now, it's balanced, specifically because of a bump stop and a bump stop on the preceding side. It will have effectively raised areas that allow for it to seat inside of the outer engine block area. That's where hydraulic fluid for the bearing ultimately is. Right? As it can pass into that, it can float on it, and then it can go around and consistently replace itself. It doesn't really ever need it, though, to be replaced for all intents and purposes. It's an air engine, so it'll never really get that hot is effectively what I went with until I realized as I continued going along with the prototype that is not the case. I actually did need that. I did it anyways because I already had versions of other concept prototypes that are very similar, so I figured that would be fine. But it's another version of one side and another side both have these little, take your fingers effectively. So you got your hand, and you're going to have stick some of your fingers through the other fingers while it's flat. And it's like, oh, that's going to ride through that, right? And then you're going to do it on the other side as well. Sort of like, that'll slide in and slot into those areas so it doesn't move off track. And now it has a bearing and a seal, as one side is the bearing and the other side is the seal, and it can't escape around the gapping that's there. Because if you didn't know, you can also take those vertical fingers. There's a side finger array that's also there, which can fit into those grooves I talked about, which makes it really difficult for air to get around it and seals it quite substantially. So, I have the center and the outsides as areas I push air into, because this is pushing air in. All right, you got to push air in. There's got to be fluid though here, because if you weren't aware, I don't use axles for this. I'm using fluid to time, along with the valves, my rotating up and down injectors. All right, single stroke injectors. It needs to rotate somehow. Well, valves help them rotate. It needs to know when to go up. Well, fluid helps it move up and move back down. In so doing, though, the process allows for heat to be exchanged back into the injector chambers. Same thing with the cooling. Okay, so I have a super turbo here. Yeah, I'm all about super turbos. If you don't know, I'm the super turbo guy. I love super turbos. I hate burning extra fuel just to make a turbine spin up. Anti-lag bothers me because it's a waste of fuel and it's very inefficient. When you're talking about an air engine, that's going to matter a lot. Okay? So, that super turbo, though, is a different type of turbine setup for what it's worth as well, and there has to be a oil, so everything's effectively a hydraulic fluid here, one-to-one sort of system, but most of that heat is usually not great. But for an air engine, that's perfect. I want that. Friction turns into more power when I exchange it back into during compression and during injection. Now, the turbine, which is going to be there after it expands and loses a certain amount of its heat energy to the opposed piston engine, and of course, the turbine into the exhaust as well, which I'll get to in a bit, but the turbine in its own right effectively helps exchange heat back into that fluid. Now that fluid, because there's going to be a pressure differential here, which is how it actually helps the super turbo part of this. So the turbo is still connected, but Stirling pressure differentials, lower pressure and a higher pressure here, means combined with I'm already pushing air into this, allows for an ever increasing way to have a Stirling runaway effect from the atmospheric conditions of extra heat I am going to be able to add in. Heat pumps. You gotta love them. But we're not actually going to get more out of that In fact, it just extends the range and duration of the air battery you currently have. So hold your horses if you think I'm anywhere near done. This just makes it more efficient. So, as I have a Stirling difference, this will also spin up the compressor. Now, the exhaust is an entirely different thing because we're going to recapture that heat as a metal sponge heat pump Stirling device. It happens to have a vacuum diaphragm. It will go into a series of sliding tubes that are effectively the equivalent of a Jules-Thomson two-stroke engine, smaller to medium to large. And in so doing, it will exchange its given heat into the liquid, as the heat will then get exchanged from the liquid that we're using, the engine coolant, lubricant, oil, because it's hydraulic fluid, will then be exchanged during the process of going into the drawing in air of the compressor, from the compressor into the nozzles of our injectors, but also into the injectors themselves. Hydraulic fluid pressure is a 1-to-1 non-compressible, meaning non-Newtonian fluid, which means it will not expand or contract, which makes it ideal for heat exchange processes as a pump of different pressures and heats. As it moves, that helps pump the fluid around, but it also happens to, because as air is moving through after the turbine, as it has an expansionary ring that goes out, but also back into the given heat exchanger, as the heat will be exchanged, but then it will have come out as a condensed air that really is not moving much at all, and in fact is most likely chock full of this stuff called humidity. And here's a nice little tidbit. There's still more humid air around, but there's less humid air coming in because it's moving. You guessed it. That makes, if you were unaware, you might want to look this up, but they have humidity generating material, or electrically generating material. So they have these generators of electricity because there's a humid point over here, like where you're drying your clothes, versus the outside air. Okay? And you're going to have to look that study up, but effectively, that's what this is. It's the equivalent of that. And so that electricity then gets used, as it will then further be condensed during that, as we'll also try and draw in more actual air from around and heat from around as it wants to go to the colder area, creating a piezoelectric resistance, not to mention that because it's air that we're talking about here, until you realized what I'm doing, which means air is not going to be anywhere near like regular air by the time it goes into that engine that we have. Now, that means I'm getting more electricity, which means instead of running linear generators, which would be far more efficient to most, I decided to run a Stirling engine-esque effect with You're going to love this. A fluid and a diaphragm, and then a vacuum. So it's like this piston is going to move a fluid. There's a vacuum here with a diaphragm on the other side of it. Which, if you didn't know, that's now able to become a Stirling engine pump, because that's its crank. Fluid here, vacuum there, air getting moved around with a diaphragm on one side or another means it's a crank. And it can compress it, it can heat it up, or it can cool it down, depending on how you do it. Mine's there to compress. I'm going to take heat energy from this fluid and send it into the compressed air. I'm then going to send it into the compressor. That is a standard centripetal compressor. Centrifugal, centripetal, right? With a ram air-esque intake. So ramming air in, because the vehicle is moving, because it's supposed to go to a vehicle, makes it more efficient at helping compress air, but then I also made it even more efficient because I'm making Stirling effects here, also turn the damn thing and make even greater amounts of air. And then I made it even more efficient because I was like, but wait, my crank is now a compressor. But then I made it even more efficient because, but wait, my turbine now gets moved also by pressure differences because of my exhaust area. But wait, I'm not done. Now there's electrical heating resistive pressure differences, as it's more condensed and more pressured over here, and also it happens to be less dense because it's hotter over there and it's moving, which helps the very definition of a ram air and Stirling effect occur to compress it even harder and draw in even more air. But wait, I said there's even more going on with this engine, didn't I? That means there are definitely piezoelectrics everywhere. There's even this shit called thermoelectric and thermal photovoltaic materials involved for the piston heads, the connecting rods, the cylinder walls, and the engine block. Now, if you don't know, this is the metal sponge for the exhaust, as I continuously recapture the vast majority of the heat. And then I add more and more and more and more heat and more and more and more pressure. I get more and more and more power. But I'm not done yet, because I was like, but wait, there's more. I have to go pee real quick, so I'm going to pause this. All right. So where was I? So as more and more work energy that I didn't get gets added back into the volume of energy I am putting back in, as the air battery that I've currently started off with really just helps to further increase and potentiate the effects of absorbing more and more energy from our atmosphere. It will eventually be able to sustain itself just off of that alone, without needing to get into any of the humidities or piezoelectrics or anything really else that I talked about. But we're not really done, because you guessed it, I'm a real stickler for details and efficiencies and amplificatory processes. I'm going to continuously condense that exhaust. It's going to come out during that process into a battery. This is a type of redox flow piezoelectric solid state field effect capacitor hybrid generator battery that I've talked about and even added basically every YouTuber that does science. And they never watched it. So if they ever see this, well, you missed your chance. Maybe you can go back and listen to how those batteries work, and then maybe you can come back and we can discuss how it is you're wrong and I'm right, and you should have shut up and just listened. Just rage baiting. Maybe they'll actually look at it for once. Too big for people. Standard shit, I'm going to move on because it's like, irregardless, it's the equivalent of how plants happen to use light to help with a very alkaline to very acidic type of protein-esque and enzymatic more than anything, structure inside of their cells to help force carbon dioxide to be removed from the double or singular oxygen bond attached. Now, these are charge fields we're talking about. Okay, that's all an ionic is. It's a given charge field of electron orbits. But when light gets involved, it happens to introduce a really neat effect by allowing for those fields to do more work during those moments in the chemical separation process. Okay, that's all it really is. Now, for me though, it's like, yeah, no, but I also happen to have liquid, I also happen to have piezoelectrics, I also happen to have an atmosphere, I also happen to have dust and debris, because fuck filtration. I also happen to have nitric oxides. And you get the picture when it comes down to, well, with a little bit of IR, and of course I have, because this is for a car, and I'm all about super hyper efficiencies and doing what appears to be impossible, like I'm getting energy from nowhere and shoving it into people's faces because they didn't know enough. And they could have been better and done better, and why don't you just get good at manufacturing and doing things right? Basically, you're a terrible, terrible company. Why aren't you doing this? Anyways, I'm going to move on because it turns into, well, here's how this works for the layman people that might not know how this might work. There are little holes like filters. As light also comes in, oh right, we were talking about the car. I have solar panels and piezoelectrics and IR emitting devices throughout the panels of the body of this car. The hood, roof, and trunk are solar panels, with in between as IR emittance, except it's really more of a destructive to constructive interference emittance device that allows for more of the light captured for the solar panels to be appropriate light for it to make electricity. While in so doing, also it's making a charge field and a low pressure fluid inside of it that has the correct, depending on the style we're talking about here, either acidic and or alkaline solution that when it tries to transfer like a vapor chamber style IR emittance phase change, it happens to undergo a pumping and movement, and then the photovoltaic part of the material has an easier time of being able to create an electron because it creates a field effect array around the material, allowing for it to more easily create electrons from the elicited excitement of that material for the given light being drawn in to them, which I've talked about several times on my YouTube channel already. This is essentially another version of that. The battery, that is. But the battery happens to have a series, you know how charges are? This is like a static charge field difference. It's like very, very high, positive. There's the negative, that is the solid state. That in order for the Hall effect that it also for the solid state to be there, it has to produce a Hall effect, meaning a reduction in the electron orbit, space, and it speeds it up. But in so doing, it also yanks out electrons, right? Kind of. It's a virtual thing. It's genuinely kind of like that. Yeah. It's like they're there, but only on a technicality do they exist there. I'm going to move on from that because that one gets into trickier quantum physics that are a little bit more nuanced in explanations because it depends on whether or not you talk about chromo, or thermodynamics in that sense. Which most people don't often know those physics, so I'd have to go on a very, very long explanation. So I'm going to get rid of that and instead say electron orbit go burr closey fire ways, and then in expansion it elicits electromagnetic field and charge field potential. As the insulative ground is there, it happens to have a substance that allows for like little tiny little itty bitty coils of copper to capture field energy and make electron. But in order to make electron move somewhere, it must now also move the positive towards it. But it can't do this as it is like electron flow redox. And so it has to go all the way over through here, through piezoelectric, into seemingly, actually maybe I must go into this fluid, because this fluid wants my electrons that I have going on, but I cannot go there as I'm separated by many insulative type of materials. But in so trying to tunnel gap around, I then, because I was basically broken up into a superposition, sort of like a polarized superposition of light, well, now I basically create a polarized superposition of virtual electrons during the tunneling, and then the possible field potentials get collapsed out into an electrode that allows for it to then draw it out. That's the field effect type that I'm talking about, that then makes more electrons than it initially started with. But it has to make light during that process, which is great because I'm going to use that fucking light in the little tiny itty bitty filter chamber tubes that are here that are going to bounce it back and forth, creating a resonance frequency pulse of different frequencies that constructively and destructively interfere with the given types of fields on the electron orbits of the chemicals coming in, meaning O2s, NO2s, CO2s, COs, dusts, and all the rest, to be separated and then collected and condensed back out into O2s, Ns, and you get the rest. It cleans the atmosphere. It's a literal cleaner to the atmosphere. The carbon gets pushed off as a negative ground area into a can, effectively, until eventually enough liquid volume of water is obtained, and then eventually we place that water into that can. The pressure that's from the engine gets sent to that water, and carbon combo, as it will then be made to phase change in a different sort of aspect and way. So you're going to have to hold your horses on this one. It basically comes out as fog. I mean, literal fog bank. Like real bright white fog that's cloud seeded, so it'll rain really fast. Which is the reason why I do it, because I want to make a lot of fog trails. So this is do you know how sperm look? You know how individuals, they have this long tail? There's a big bulbous body at the front. It's essentially what this is. And it's a look. But now I have the tail, as that's the exhaust tail. It moves around in a circular, and it's breaking Newtonian laws and physics. It's getting energy from nowhere, man. It's moving faster than it should ever move. That kind of thing. That's the reason why I made it like that. Because it's like, yeah, no, that's basically like what it would be doing. So it makes total sense to do that because, it's me, and I'm that guy that likes to put those little touches there. It's like, it looks like a sperm. Oh, yeah, no, it's a very strong aerodynamic shape that breaks the laws of physics. Meanwhile, me, who knows about a lot of physics, no, it doesn't. It's getting energy from the atmosphere. So no, but whatever. Anyways, the battery generation will make heat during that process. That's why the piezoelectrics are there. That's why the fluid is there. That's also why it gets back into the engine that we're using. And that's where the electricity also goes. Electricity goes into making more heat. Instead of direct movement, we get heat movement and energy storage capture and recapture. So, now the panels also have a lot of pressure differentials. There's a vacuum in certain areas, and there's also, you're going to want to be cold in your cabin. So in order for it to be at that temperature, it tries to take energy from the cabin and recirculate a little bit of air, just air pump. And it filters it for what it's worth, But that heat then goes into the engine. And then I have my vacuum braking system. The axles themselves are basically a composite of piezoelectric. The rims too. The heating and cooling and the air differences between air moving around and there being a vacuum here. I get a Stirling engine type pump as I move around. Same thing with this one was the best one for me. When I want very significant braking, the engine turns off sucking in air or moving in any way other than ramming air through it and allowing for it to push the very pistons outside and back in, right? Along with the vacuum braking that's there, that allows for that resistance to the engine movement to be made, and you get braking from that. That gets stored in its own right into the tank. So that movement of the air going through and the relative cooling and pressure gets made to be shoved into the air tank that we're using to allow for the engine braking's work to not be lost to just braking and movement. Yeah, it doesn't have a lot of conversion losses, but for what it's worth, that's because I'm cooling the hell out of something, and then the engine basically just becomes its own version of a compressor, as it'll just reverse it back into the engine's fuel tank, which is the air tank. It has to go somewhere. Yes, the air tank. So, I had to make it out of much lighter types of material for this to be better, but for what it's worth, this was a prototype. Prototype. It's going to be better than this. Now, I got over. So, give me a second. Without the generator battery, toss that out. 50 to 531%, depending on the entire continental United States of America and where you decided to try and test, I got extra energy back into the system. Then a up to 200% more with the battery of increase of energy over simply the air tank fuel. Now, the reason why I have such a large swing is because it depends on whether or not you're going downhill, how humid it is, how much light you're getting, how much dust there is, how much wind there is, how much heat there is, and many, many other factors that are involved, which essentially means it has a very large degree of variability for that. Okay, piezoelectrics can only convert losses that you would have normally have gotten into recovery, right? Until you start moving enough, and then they start to actually produce more because there's enough heat and mechanical stress and strain. That means you get more than what you would have otherwise, because that's heat from the air, pressure differences, and so on, right? It'll make energy, but then I also have solar panels. You can start seeing where this starts getting pretty easy to understand why you're getting more, and seemingly from nowhere at all. Oh no, there's no way you can get any other energy. There's no other. Oh, it's a perpetual. He's describing a perpetual somehow. It's perpetual. There's no other energy at all available. None whatsoever. You don't produce heat from your body. There's no heat in the atmosphere. There's no light at all. Nothing like this. There's certainly no pressure in our atmosphere. Not at all. There's no humidity. Dust doesn't exist. Pollutants, never heard of them. And I'm like, so, is this someone that says they're smart? Because they sound idiotic, if you ask me. But it's like that. That's literally what it is. If you're able to use a RAM air intake and then compressors like that, you effectively get to the point where, like, the air tank really is just a startup motor to start the process of getting it to ultimately, during its movement and the energy storage of braking, light, and so on, of continuing its, engine movement and work. So we have watches that are similar to this, if you don't know, very, very, very tight tolerances and low frictions, and it uses pressure differentials and heating from light and all that to continue its watch movement. This is that on steroids. Well, steroids wouldn't even touch this. I then ascended to my ultimate Goku instinct form. That's what this would be. You know what I mean? Like, literal ridiculous, but except it's really cheap to actually make piezoelectrics. there's only like a small few places that'll ever get really hot enough to take advantage of the thermophotovoltaic and thermoelectric generation, which is fine because that's honestly fine. Like, on it, you know what I mean? Like, I don't need to worry about, oh, well, the nozzle area is a little hot. I'm like, that's fine. I'm okay with that. Like, it's an actual engine, for what it's worth. It's just the rest of it doesn't really need that because it'll never experience heats that are something that you'd have to worry about, which is great. You know what I mean? But it means it has a very long engine life. And, oh, right, I needed to talk about this. That fluid has to do work energy in some aspect. So, that's what I wanted to talk about. All right, so the fluid getting pumped around is essentially the same thing as my 49cc liquid, hydraulic, ram style crankshaft. So the hydraulic fluid moves a turbine that heads back towards a, four-piece turbine, I guess, at top and sides, top, bottom, sides. Like, think tube. There's turbines on the sides, but then they're going to move, except I don't really fully want that, just as an FYI. This one's a bit of a different type, but it's quite similar to that, effectively. So it takes a tube, it's going to spin it up. It has stators, blades, kind of like a hubless motor, but then it's a hollow where there are little valves, kind of like a two-stroke engine on the outsides of the tube and on the inside, of course. But as it does this, it's then going to rotate because that's kind of what's necessary. But also that's connected to two plates that are from inside out, but then outside in. So like it's on the outside that it comes in at. It then diffuses through the plate, and during that, that's a type of turbine. Instead of a Stirling, this one's going to be another type of, like the bearing journal stators that have to move, but then as it does that, it's then going to go into a chamber that has to move that, around, and in order to be moved around, because it has to go not just through those little, connection bearing points, okay? It has to also move that plate, and they're connected at the ends, all right, so the edges really, where it still has to move that fluid into a larger area and then send it back to be received on the other side, or the side it came from, right? As either a 1-to-1, I use a hybrid of a 1-to-1 slash both, so 1-to-1 meaning this to that, right? To both, where it'll flow as it goes to an even higher RPM. Now, it's very efficient, mostly because it exchanges its heat back into, as a Stirling, because they're plates, remember, and the tube will have it then go from a higher pressure to a technicality-wise lower pressure because it's flowing, right? And then it goes in even, so whole thing, but that then gets captured standard, like a torque converter, axle source style, right? That you then have for the super turbo, but also just a transmission. It's a multiple CVT ring and cone setup. So like two cones, well, actually it's a series of cones, but then there are rings with a ball that they use to change gear ratios. And so this is this gearing pack, and then this gearing pack, and then this gearing pack, and this gearing pack, and this gearing pack, for a total of, you guessed it, 5 gears that all change their gear ratios from this smallest to this largest, and then it will automatically change into the next gear pack. Makes it more compact and more efficient. So it is lighter weight. Yeah, here's the thing though. They're vacuum styles. Okay, so like for the ring and the cones and everything, there's a vacuum inside of the gears and cones, right? And then there's pressure for the fluid, and it has to exchange by going somewhere else to where the vacuum wants it, kind of like an iron redox flow. So in order for it to do that, it then exchanges its heat back into the rest of the system for the engine. Now, that means with the piezoelectrics that are there as well, as it exchanges heat to cold, cold to heat, it moves, it makes more electricity, and it happens to improve efficiency for its given design. The axles are hollow with a vacuum inside. Then there's piezoelectrics that are added in. So as it will bind and bunch, then that energy storage gets put back into the engine. They're rifled on the inside too, and on the outside as well, to make it stronger and much less material now. Right? The housing for the axle is hollow as well, and it sits effectively in a bushing that's a vacuum seal bushing. So it's a bearing that's a vacuum. There's a bunch of vacuums everywhere. Literally, it's a bunch of Hall effect magnetic bearings that are a bunch of vacuum areas, like everywhere. Remember the Hall effect as it moves? I do that with the axles. Yeah, so it's like they'll squeeze and everything, and or like extend, you know what I mean? And that helps change CVT gearing as well. I have an all-wheel drive, so four-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, but it's torque vectoring using a CVT gearing change. The rims are, of course, hollow, filled with a vacuum. The majority of the inside of the tire is a vacuum with only pressure where necessary. So it has even less weight attached to it, but yes, you guessed it, there's more piezoelectrics in those vacuum areas because pressure is here and pressure's not there, and it will expand and contract equals electricity, which means heat. For my engine. Do you have wind? That's electricity because of movement. Did you walk by it? Electricity. Did you glance well enough? You might get electricity from moving your body with enough reflective properties to get my solar panels electricity. Then there are field effects, the Hall effect kind of thing for the squeezing part, for the vacuums inside. And so that also might get you some electricity if you looked at it well. I want all the heat and electricity I could ever get. And so that's what this is. It will make so much electricity and heat that I never really ever have to do much at all. And that's without the battery. So 50 to 531% is what that ends up being. And then the batteries up to 200%, which depends again on, for sure, humidity, particle distribution, so on, and heat that's available. So it's down to 100% no matter what, but also 200%. And this is, wait for it, Denver, Colorado. All right, levels of air spread out throughout the entirety of the United States of America. So, like, have fun with that. Because I was not getting into weather effects after a bit. I was like, fuck this. Pressure dynamics are annoying as fuck to have to deal with when they constantly change. I was mostly just going with rolling resistance, inclination, slope changes and average particle distribution and pollutant area sizes and humidity sizes instead of wind and anything else like that. So it'll get even better and more accurate if you were to put that into your calculations. I'm not going to do it because that's a lot. I'm going to have so much extra electricity, you'll literally never need to refill your air tank for what it's worth. Because you just leave it outside and it'll basically trickle charge into that air tank. I just don't need it. But that was the prototype. Okay, so the prototype is the prototype because it's a prototype, because it's an opposed piston, and it's bad at doing what it does. It has to stop, and then go back and stop, and then go back and stop, and then go back, and it just sucks. I hate them. So we got a type of turbine that looks an awful lot like a torque converter fuel cell-ish type thing. So there's a bunch of tiny little gaps. There's a central stator. There's 2 counter-rotating areas, and as they go through, they'll exchange and change pressure rates, and it'll go from center out as a turbine. Humidity, filtration, battery, all the rest of it is done all at once. So I have a different type of motor, because it's no longer an axle motor, because the tube itself is also an electric motor, but so is the axle part, but then so is the housing, and so is a lot of other things. For the linear generation, attractive forces and repulsive forces going on that also help with the battery generation and more. Which effectively means I am my own motor. I will call it a Lemke motor. It is the Lemke flux motor generator battery thing. That's also a fuel cell and all the rest of that. Now it's much more compact. The metal sponge is a lot easier to put back in. The same thing with the exhaust. And the recirculator part is essentially another version of another torque converter for the metal sponge, sending the heat and electricity changes for the redox flow back in towards the intake. The air tank is now smaller. Valving is easier. Exchange rates are higher. I don't need a separate battery. I weigh even less. And the rest of the vehicle still works just fine. But I changed it into a series of vacuum plates in this instance that are like my engine braking for the Hall effect style, that allow for me to dynamically alter gearing throughout an entire range of areas, kind of like a hard disk drive flatter, for like short stroke or, outside, middle, center, different areas of gearing there. And then I can stack plates basically sideways, horizontally, at tops and side, and then a central core of different plates. And I can dynamically change that to have the absolute best gear ratio for the traveling in speed I'm at. Because I have a lot of gears, but they're all very, very compact, and most of it's essentially a bunch of plates that don't have a lot of air. No, they have a vacuum around them, and they only need to have the barest minimum of some level of contact, which truthfully I got rid of that, like I talked about with the vacuum brake, but they don't really need to slide with that rod. I just suggested the rod because you would probably be able to understand that, but I just never used a rod. If you gap it right, it'll just float with fields, which is a bearing, effectively. So that allows for me to do that with my ultra compact, small as fuck transmission. that has what is about 257-ish gears that have infinite variability for each and every one of them, and way less than any standard transmission will ever, and produce electricity and heat back into the engine during its movement in engine braking, vacuum braking, combo, all that. Now, it went from 200% with the battery, with the up to 531% for very specific types of things in the south, right? With higher humidities and some dust, particles, and all that, to across the board 500% increase of energy during operation and movement of the vehicle as it's going. So I charge and store energy of my vehicle constantly. That's consistent. Like, you can go higher, but it'll never go below that. That's when I turned into the next thing I was going to talk about, which would have been airships. You ready for that one? Tune in for the next video that's about to come out. But I'll talk a little bit more about the car a little bit further, mostly because this also turned into motorcycles. A single-seater style enclosed-ish cabin. All right, so I say ish because if you've ever seen Dragon Ball Z, they used to have these, styles of motorcycles that would have like a genuine like air, shroud or whatever they call it over the occupants of the vehicle, right? Of the motorcycle. And I thought that was really cool, and I'm sad it never caught on. So I basically made a version of that, but with a single person in it. And you can still ultimately seal those sides, okay? But it's more teardrop-y-esque shape with a single wide wheel in the rear with two smaller, so it's a trike instead of a motorcycle. And that's fine, honestly, because I'm genuinely just fine with that instead of four wheels for that guy. Although it actually technically really only has the three for the sperm shape. This one's more of a genuine trike. But you can actually remove the two wheels in the front and have it be a full single for two wheels only motorcycle. Right? The reason why I have it as two, though, is because it will tilt and lean just fine, and the rear and two front wheels will also tow in, camber, and all the rest to help with steering. You can absolutely do burnouts. You're just going to do them slightly differently, and you'll be able to turn ridiculously fast, because this will curve you in so hard, like super, motor GP levels of you're tilted over doing this, while having all of that extra traction. So a lot of people didn't want to experience 9+ G's of turning force, especially with the ground effects and more that are there. And I was like, yeah, I feel you on that. Like, driving's supposed to be fun and just enjoyable. But you have a trunk now. You have the ability to have a second passenger that's not going to feel cramped. Okay, and you can pull a trailer behind you. It's another teardrop shape for what it's worth, but motorcycles can do that. So I never really saw it as a bad thing. But the motorcycle thing was simple stuff. It's a pointy, it's really not like the sperm shape, which is still like teardrop-esque, but it's a lot different in terms of how it points and everything. This one is much more like, it's more like an actual motorcycle front end for what it's worth, like a super, like bike, like a sports bike, right? Like it's like that, and really going to be either sitting recumbent style or leaning forward in a drag race position. There's no up and down with this. So, have fun, I guess. I think it's fine, personally. It's going to be a really fun little race and ride if you ever try and use it. The Spermmobile is not really called, for what it's worth. It's called the Whale SPM, just as an FYI. It's the size of a whale. Big boy. It's a very strong, very great shape. It helps and lends well, not just to aerodynamics, but crash safety too, as it's very good at absorbing impact from any and all sides, which is very nice, because it has multiple triangular, curved, spreading out impact force shapes. It doesn't have enough of a point to really be something detrimental to any passengers. Or, I'm sorry, pedestrians, not passengers. Right? But at the same time, I would have gone even harder on the shape had I not been restricted for certain legal parameters of how I'm allowed to shape the front end of a vehicle. It would have been a bit more bumpy and have some channeling along the sides. And a little bit more pointy in the front end. It would have been a little bit more rough if it got a person in front of it accidentally. It would have pushed them off to the side, though. And it's not in a way for the channels or the bumps to, like, cut into them or like, crush them or anything. But I got the not allowed from the people that tell you whether or not you are or not to do that. So that's kind of what that ended up being. And it kind of sucked. So, Anyways, that's the end of it. Bye. Please like and subscribe.